can't sit still. I'm angry. I'm hurt. At times feeling hopeless. Mm-hmm. But then sometimes, like, I look at my son and I'm like, hell no, I got to keep going. And what do I need to do?
That was Kelly Rowland speaking on the fatal arrest of George Floyd in Minnesota. And I got to say, Kelly's emotions are quite honestly how a lot of people are feeling today. And I want to bring in Dometi Pongo from MTV News, who joins me now. First of all, it's so good to see you, brother. So thanks for being here.
Man, thank you for having me, Denny. I really appreciate it, man.
Well, listen, I'm glad you're here because I think your perspective and voice on this story and what's going on is an important one. I mean, you obviously, the death of George Floyd and the riots in Minnesota and across the country, they're hard to ignore. And you've tackled this head on and really, I feel like, thoughtfully addressed the situation and sprinkled some like context, you know, on like the deeply rooted issues in this story. And so, and you know, a story which, by the way, is a familiar one in this country, sadly, you know? And so as someone who has addressed this and tackled the current news head on, what has been your reaction and response to the public outcry?
Well, it's been sad how much of what has happened today relates so much to what we've seen happen back in Ida B. Wells' time, in Martin Luther King's time. Right. And that's a lot of the storytelling that I've been doing right now, is trying to figure out how we can contextualize and explain this unrest, why we can explain why so many people feel fed up. You know, you would think it would be obvious because we're seeing this footage out there, but so many people aren't confronted with this issue of police brutality as viscerally as the African-American community. So there are well-meaning people who are really just getting up to speed. So, you know, as reporters, trying to find the best way that I can to put all of this into context, to give people the information they need to figure out what they can do with that outrage, and how can we make sure that justice is served for Floyd's family.
And it's not always easy, especially for journalists too, when you're addressing these kind of stories. There's days that are harder than others. There's reporters like us who are on the front lines. Like, for example, just this morning, earlier this day, CNN reporter Omar Jimenez, he was arrested live on television during his coverage. And I'm curious to know what your reaction to that was.
It was symbolic of the time that we're in right now. In one of the episodes of Need to Know, you know, that's actually out right now, it's pinned on the MTV News Twitter page. We talk about how when you see oppressive regimes, oppressive systems of corrupt power, there are usually two things that characterize them. One, it emboldens a police state, and two, there's a discrediting of the press. Yeah. And President Trump, with his tweet, emboldened the police by saying when the looting starts, the shooting starts. And then that arrest on CNN of Omar Jimenez was embarrassing to our country. You know, one of the most fundamental rights we have is that First Amendment right. And we are America because of the freedom of the press. And, you know, it was later on, I must say, that Omar later said that it was explained to him as a misunderstanding. He said he asked the arresting officer, why am I being arrested? Was later told, I don't know, man, I'm following orders. And he thought that he was in the place that he was designated to be, even though his white colleague was not arrested. But it brings to the fore this issue of, you know, this concept of fake news constantly being tossed out there, this war with facts that we're seeing right now in our country, and something that can happen at such a sensitive time, watching a colleague in journalism be arrested as he's trying to tell the country about this. It's mind-boggling. And he was arrested before Derek Chauvin was arrested. The guy who was reporting about a murder was arrested before the alleged murderer.
And that's the wild part, right? Is just because if you stick to the facts, it's the fact that a CNN reporter, a journalist, was arrested before the officers involved in George Floyd's case. And I think that's what caused an uproar. And if that's just one little example, right, of everything we've been dealing with. And obviously there's so much outcry. So many celebrities have been outspoken about what's going on. You know, Oprah, actually, she called Floyd a mighty soul because of his, like, quote, sphere of influence on the country right now. Cardi B said police brutality is nothing new. And as we mentioned, Kelly Rowland, she told ET she hopes what happened to George Floyd is a call to action for everybody. In fact, she said, if you're not Black, you should be appalled. If you're not Black, you should be moving. So a question I have for you is, what can non-Blacks and white allies do in times like these?
That is a great question. I first want to begin by commending the white allies that I've been seeing on the ground in Minnesota. You know, when you look at those images, there are so many people of all different races mobilizing behind this.
Mm-hmm.
So one, I would say, if you're an ally, you're seeing what's happening, you're just as outraged, start conversations within your home. I talk about often how we all have our own spheres of influence, no matter how big our platforms may be. Those of you who choose to speak out on social media, use that to do that. Those of you who love to get engaged civically, call your congressperson and see what legislation that you can support that is going to enact more protections for people who come in contact with police officers. And then also just have conversations within your friend groups, your group chat, the people you know, the well-meaning people you know, who have perhaps for so long been uninformed of the condition that non-white people go through in this country. Mm-hmm. And in your everyday interactions, make sure you're not purposely or inadvertently weaponizing your white privilege. I say that thinking of the Amy Cooper situation, the woman who was in the Ramble in Central Park with her dog, who threatened to call the police and lie and tell them that an African-American man was threatening to kill her. You know, there might not be situations that extreme, but in what ways have conflicts been used as an opportunity to weaponize the privilege that you might have that you may not even be 100% aware of or understanding of? So, you know, educate yourself on it and continue to have those conversations.
And also use your platform, if you have one, for good. I think we've seen that a lot this week amongst everybody, really. But one a particular celebrity that surprised me because she directly addressed and tweeted President Trump was Taylor Swift. She called out President Trump for threatening violence against the protesters. Did her response and the fact that she even tweeted to begin with surprise you at all?
You know what? I'm always surprised when pop stars at a certain level of success, especially someone who's not, you know, part of the minority community, speaks out. And I love that she used this as an opportunity to do that, because I'm hoping that people begin, she quoted and said, you know, how could you say basically, you know, when the looting starts, the shooting starts. I'm so glad she put that out there on a larger platform, because maybe conversations will begin in that thread to really break down why that was so injurious. Why was that so offensive? You know, if you do the research, you know, the quote actually comes from a racist Miami police chief by the name of Walter Hetley, who in 1967 said that quote before weaponizing the police to terrorize African Americans who were protesting unrest back then. And he characterized them as slum hoodlums in the same way that Trump characterized these protesters
as thugs. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, you know, it allows, when pop stars use their voices to amplify these issues, it allows us to dig below the surface and call out this behavior for exactly what it is. It's racist.
Especially for Taylor, for someone who has, like Taylor, I should say, who honestly is just now coming into her political voice. It wasn't until 2018 that she took a stand on anything political or controversial. So I feel like it's important. It's important not just for the optics, but to actually maybe enact some change. And you know, I want to talk about the riots and the protest scenes that are happening around the country, and especially in Minnesota right now, because I think it has prompted a conversation and a discussion about effective protesting, something that you contextualized in a recent report on MTV News. So the question for you is, like, what do you say, or what do you think riots really say about the protesters in that city?
Great question. Riots are the language of the unheard, in the words of Martin Luther King Jr., which I'm sure a lot of people have been seeing that said right now. But what he went on to say was, we need to condemn riots as vigorously as we condemn the conditions that spark them. And I think that, you know, it's unfortunate to see, you know, the city, you know, bursting up in flames. It's unfortunate to see, you know, folks potentially being harmed. I think there were reports of one person being killed as a result of this unrest. But we also need to ask ourselves, when the situation with Ahmaud Arbery, where an arrest didn't come until 2 months later and until this footage came out. And in this case, when we saw this footage, a man resting, kneeling on a man's neck for over 7 minutes, about 8 minutes, and we didn't get an arrest until 4 days later. If not for the city being turned upside down, if not for the chaos, would Derek Chauvin be behind bars?
So do you think so do you think the public outrage kind of applied pressure there to make sure that he was taken into custody?
I think we can't underestimate the impact of public pressure.
Yeah.
And I think public pressure can take various forms. Sometimes it can become as ugly as rioting and looting, but I think those things happen when there's a powder keg, when so much has happened and that frustration builds up. And there's something that people often say when people riot in their communities. They say, why would you destroy your own community?
Right.
Well, there's a reason that these people don't feel like this community is their own.
Is their own, yep.
Yeah, these stores aren't owned by the people who's there. They sometimes aren't even eligible for jobs in these communities, at these places. So very much so, they may live there, but these aren't their communities. And so I think it's a lot to unpack and understand there, no matter what you believe about rioting. But I think in different forms of protest, but I think it's important to state that if not for extreme public outcry, I don't believe Derek Chauvin would have been arrested.
Absolutely. I want to end our chat talking a little bit more and honoring George Floyd's life. Tell us what you know about him. Who is he? Who is George Floyd?
Yeah, I was researching this, and I posted George Floyd's story on my Facebook page. And a friend of mine from my church, shared an article with me from Christianity Today. And and in the article, it profiled George Floyd as someone who had moved to Minnesota through a job program made available through a church ministry. He was eulogized by friends who tweeted that this was the guy who helped him take a baptism pool to an area in the projects so that dudes in the hood could be baptized. I mean, this is a guy who's known for volunteering. This is a guy who's known for cleaning up his neighborhood, and by all accounts, just a fun-loving, sweet guy who had just moved to Minneapolis to start a new life because he lost his job in the wake of the pandemic. And this is what had happened to him. So it's very sad. But I'm very fortunate for outlets like yours that give us an opportunity to properly eulogize him. So the last image we see of him is this loving, peaceful guy, and not the one who went out the way that he did.
Absolutely. Dometi Pongo, MTV News, thank you so much for joining me. I'll let Kelly Rowland speak for us, and that I hope that this unrest and this anger will be channeled into some serious action. And on that note, after the break, you guys, we will be covering some other entertainment trending news stories, but here's more of our interview with Kelly Rowland.
It's a tough day today. I don't know why today is the tough day, but I mean, I know why, but it's like yesterday I was just mad, like red mad. And then last night it was like tough to sleep. Like it's like, and I'm happy that it's actually bothering us to the way it is now, because that's when action happens. But we have to have a way to move together, if that makes any sense. Like, we need a way to move together, because if we move and we're just acting out of all this anger and madness and emotion, we have to be collected and unified. But this is years upon years of oppression and depression, and it's so deeply rooted. And that's why it's just, we're having a tough time with all this. It's so much trauma. Even watching it every day is trauma. What is this going to do to us in 10 years? We're watching it. How can you not be appalled? Even if you're not Black, you should be appalled. If you're not Black, you should be moving. You should be saying something, posting something. If you have a Black kid, you know what I mean? I'm so much.